and this is Burning Issues. Welcome to our third episode in our series where we are examining what the California wildfires can teach us about policy.
On today's episode, we address one of the most pressing issues. That's housing. It's on a lot of people's minds. It poses a lot of challenges, but also opportunities. For this episode, we will be guided by Jonas. So, Jonas, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thanks, Emily. Indeed, housing is a huge issue in California as prices are rising every year, which is not surprising as it's just a basic economic phenomena when there's a lot of demand but very low offer. And the thing with wildfire is they just make this issue worse because they just destroy the houses, which is what is so deeply needed. In 2020 alone, 11,000 structures were destroyed, and that's residence buildings, but also commercial properties, outbuildings, and other structures that were declared lost. And that was in 3,500 fires that burned close to 1.5 million acres, which is just such an insane number that I just cannot wrap my head around. I did the math, and it's over 1 million football fields that were burned, which is still a number that's hard to comprehend, but maybe that helps some people picture it better. And so in our episode, the goal will be to discuss what can people do to protect their houses. So we're going to go over mitigation behaviors, but also what can be done at a bigger policy level. And we're going to examine different strategies that the government is now using. And one thing that really struck me when I was doing my research here was that 82% of the houses that are being destroyed are in the so-called WUI. And that's the wildlife-urban interface. And that's basically the zone of transition between unoccupied land and human development. So it's like this area at the outskirts of cities where you have a lot of vegetation and a few houses that are scattered in between. And of course, the vegetation is just fuel for the fires. They're able to prosper and destroy a whole lot of houses there.
Jonas, I'm really excited to hear from the experts that you spoke to. So to start off, who are the people that are living in the WUI, and why are they living there if there's such a high risk?
I spoke with Dan Lang, who worked as a firefighter from 1967 to 2007. And during those 40 years, he worked in various positions until eventually becoming a chief. As a deputy chief, he was responsible for several statewide fire prevention programs, including open burning, defensible space inspections, and power line and railroad fire prevention. And since his retirement from firefighting in 2008, he has worked as a senior grant specialist for the California Fire Safe Council. And with a small hiatus in there, he is now serving his last few days before a well-deserved retirement. So we're really glad to have caught his insights before he actually retires. So let's hear from you, Dan. Who lives in the WUI and why?
Yeah, the state of California has done a lot of research on that, obviously, over the years. And they come up with a current statistic that says the average resident of the wildland-urban interface area is 46.4 years old. They have a median household income that's 7% above the statewide average. Median net worth that's 108% above the statewide average. They also have a racial and ethnic diversity index of 84, on a scale of 0 being no diversity and 100 being complete diversity. So it's a fairly well integrated society in the WUI.
So are those people not able to afford living somewhere else?
Well, I guess the answer to that is I think only if they can't afford to move, because there is more and cheaper housing available in urban areas than there is in the WUI.
And so if they can move, what makes the WUI so attractive?
A lot of people, myself included, move there to get away from urban centers and get to an area where there is lower housing density and lower crime rate, more opportunities for outdoor recreation, and all those kinds of reasons.
So it does make sense for people to live there. It sounds like there's a widespread appeal to moving into these developments. It's fairly normal. It's a great community to live in. People get to be close to nature, and I understand this now.
Yeah, and it's also the case that it's a very diverse community there, right? People come with all different sorts of socioeconomic backgrounds, and they are not necessarily forced to live there, right? Because they could afford to live somewhere else.
Yet it must be in the back of their mind this certain level of stress associated with living there, knowing that there are wildfires, there's a history of it, especially if you are a young family, you have small children. Definitely something that they're thinking about. What can people do that live there to protect themselves?
They can adopt so-called mitigation behaviors, but that's one of the things Dan really worked on. So Dan, can you tell us more about which ones are the most cost-effective and most efficient ones?
The most cost-effective one is clearing flammable vegetation to 100 feet or more around any structure that could be exposed to encroaching wildfire. That is by far the cheapest and most effective way to do it. Many people don't realize that, but it changes their environment. A lot of people don't like the idea that they're moving the brush away from their property out to 100 feet, and they're afraid that that's going to compromise their confidentiality of where they live or whatever. But that's what keeps the radiant heat away from your house, is keeping the flammable vegetation away. That's probably the single most cost-effective one. Other ones are, if you're going to build a place there, or if you're going to retrofit a structure, to retrofit it with fire-resistant building materials, fire-resistant siding, Class A roof, replacing an old roof system with a new Class A roof installation, and installing triple pane windows throughout the structure. It reduces your energy costs and keeping the house warm and cold, but also it dramatically reduces the fire loss because there's no fire impingement when a window. Single pane windows break real easily when they're impinged by fire, but triple pane windows don't. UL has approved them, and they're shown to be real cost effective. And then a little bit less cost effective on that scale, installing or building a property perimeter sprinkler system. It's really not that expensive to do if you have a swimming pool already, especially like an in-ground pool with a pool pump. At that point, all you have to do is do some exterior plumbing and use some sensors for when to turn the automatic systems on and off. So that's pretty cost effective actually, but it's probably a little more expensive.
These sound great and very interesting. I'm just wondering, how effective are those? And is there any scientific evidence to by how much they can reduce the likelihood of a fire completely destroying a house?
These behaviors can completely eliminate the risk of a house being burned if they're used at initial construction, number one, or possibly retrofitted when you put a new roof on. But Underwriters Laboratories has just conducted some extensive tests on fire-resistant building materials on full-scale houses in burn chambers, and that simulate the worst-case scenarios. And they prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that if you build the structure with the right building materials, and if you remove the flammable vegetation from around it, it will survive. Yeah, that's why the insurance companies, their underwriters are telling them that clearance around structures is the most cost-effective thing to do. And so that's why the insurance companies are getting on their policyholders now and saying, look, if you we're going to raise your premiums, number one, just because of where you live, but number two, if you can show us you've done some things to mitigate the hazard on your own property, then we might be able to give you a 10% discount or something like that. So a lot of insurance companies are doing that. Some people have let their homeowners insurance lapse because insurance rates have escalated a lot in the last decade, especially, and where more and more homeowners who don't have a loan on their property are gambling and saying, okay, I'm just not going to pay that for fire insurance this year. And every year, a lot of them walk away with nothing.
Wow. One thing that really stands out to me from that is the risk that people are taking, especially letting their insurance lapse. If these mitigation behaviors are effective, we know they're effective, why are people taking these risks? Why are so many houses still being destroyed?
Yeah, and like you mentioned, insurance is a huge issue, and we will actually touch on it again in just a few minutes. But I think it's like Dan said, trimming flammable vegetation is a big change to your beloved environment, so you don't necessarily want to clear all of the bushes. Refitting a house is also a very significant financial investment. And even though they are greatly efficient, we have the science to live there. We can build houses that can totally eliminate the risk. Sometimes you just don't have the money to refit your house. And the property perimeter sprinkler system that you might have talked about is actually maybe the least intrusive and still an efficient way of doing that. But one other thing that I came across during my research is the so-called risk perception gap, right? And that's the difference between the actual risk of a property being burnt and the perceived risk by their owners. And so it turns out that many homeowners seriously underestimate the risk of their house being burned. And so why exactly is that, Dan?
Well, I think in the first place, most people don't want to think about what their risk is. It's inconvenient truth, as Al Gore said, that they may be living in an area that they're exposed to a hazard that they could do something about. So a lot of them just don't want to think about it. So once it's brought to their attention by their insurance companies possibly saying, hey, we're not going to reinsure your house this year because we just had a big wildfire down the road and we proved it can happen here. So things like that will start to get the property owners' attention about doing something to mitigate their risk, because the insurance companies don't want to underwrite risks that can be mitigated.
So once this perception gap is closed, do you observe more mitigation behaviors being adopted by local residents?
If you look at areas that have suffered a wildland-urban interface fire, and you watch the regrowth of that neighborhood after in subsequent years, the houses that burned, many of them are rebuilt, but for the houses that didn't burn, you can go through there and the hazardous fuel reduction work has usually pretty much all been done by the springtime. And for the lots that aren't done, the property owners are jabbing their neighbors to get their job done.
Right. The mitigation behaviors are most effective if everybody does them, right? You don't want the brush from your neighbor to propagate a fire onto your own house. And so it really only works if the entire neighborhood is taking part. And as you said, neighbors are pushing each other to get the mitigation behaviors done. But is there something else we could do? I don't know. I'm just brainstorming, but I'm thinking of like a workshop where you teach homeowners the actual risk of fire in the place that you're living in and how effective the mitigation behaviors are. Is such a workshop something that would help propagate the use of these mitigation behaviors?
Well, absolutely. You could put on a class like that would be, a 1 hour class that would make sure that they're thoroughly indoctrinated to, what the risks are that they're living with. But yeah, it could definitely.
Interesting. I do think that educating people would help close some of this perception gap. Especially, it might give people the necessary motivation or reminder when they have a moment one weekend to go outside and get the leaves out of the gutters, just as an example.
Oh, absolutely. I am not the biggest fan of yard work myself, but learning how risky it is not to do some of those mitigation behaviors would definitely help me get off the couch on a sunny weekend.
I don't believe that you've ever slept in a day in your life. But definitely the education would have an impact in focusing on some of these important risks that we know have a positive effect on reducing wildfire spread. I'm wondering, though, how coordinated should the effort be? You mentioned, the risk that your neighbor might impose on you. Are the mitigation behaviors most effective at the local, neighborhood, or individual level?
Well, they're absolutely most effective at the property owner level. And the reason I say that is because, number one, the property owner is doing everything that he can to minimize the chances of his own property burning. And if all of his neighbors are doing the same thing, then the community as a whole risk goes down. You don't have scenarios like what just happened near Boulder, Colorado, where 1,000 homes burn in the same wildfire one night. If each individual property owner there had done what it took to be sure that their own property could survive a wildfire moving through it, then that would have never happened the way it did.
Yeah, again, like we said, it's basically everyone's own responsibility towards himself, his family, and the community to use risk mitigation behaviors, which makes total sense. Emily, you don't really seem satisfied with that answer.
Yeah, with such a big risk to a community, I keep thinking that there must be something that can be done at the local government level.
Well, luckily, Rob might be able to answer your question. Rob Olshansky is a professor of urban and regional planning, and his teaching and research have covered land use and environmental planning with an emphasis on planning for natural hazards, so he is right down our alley. And most notably, he has published extensively on post-disaster recovery planning. Recently, he co-authored a paper named Rebuilding for a Resilient Recovery, where he analyzed strategies to recover from wildfires in California. And so, Rob, at what level do we need to tackle those problems that fires are causing us?
We talked about how disruptive a fire is, or even the threat of a fire. I think about the fire in Paradise. 20,000 residents had to move after they were burned out. And so we're always thinking about those people, and rightly so, but there's also where they go to. And mostly where they go to is somewhere nearby in the region. And so these things, they are regional problems. They create costs and social issues throughout the area. So we think we need to think about regional solutions.
So now I can really see how this turns into a regional level problem as people are forced to relocate within the area that continues to be heavily fire prone. So what's being done at the regional level to address some of these problems?
Well, historically, there's really been an emphasis on firefighting, right? You kind of build wherever you want, and whenever there's a fire, we pay firefighters to put those fires out. But over time, we have started to understand how everything is interconnected. And in the last 10 years, there has been an expansion of the tools being used. So most notably in 2008, we signed a law which is called the Materials and Construction Methods for Exterior Wildlife Exposure. So basically, it has changed the home hardening codes based on the fire risk. So if you live in a very fire-prone area, you might have to build a house that is much safer, that uses fireproof materials, etc. So in the WUI now, new houses are a lot safer than they used to be. And another big thing, of course, is vegetation management and controlled burns, which you, Emily, talked about at length in your episode.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that kept coming up is how we've changed the way we think about land management, land stewardship, and some of our practices in the past haven't always been good for preventing large wildfires from occurring. There's controlled burns, there's a natural process that has to take place, so we're not exacerbating a problem.
Right, and the good news is that it's an accelerating process. We're understanding how all of these things work much faster, and things are changing. But there is still not enough emphasis on land use solutions, which Rob's research is all about.
Yeah, so on that note, what do you do in such a populated state? The houses are where the people are. They can't just move from one day to another. It could take decades to build out new communities or reshape the way we're working.
But when you're building in hazardous areas and a disaster happens, and particularly something like a fire that really wiped all the buildings that were there, it does raise interesting questions about ways that you might recover after the fire. And we changed the codes in 2008. So there's all these buildings built before 2008 that don't have the requirements for roofs and defensible space and all those kinds of things. And so if some of those houses burn, obviously what happens, the most obvious thing that happens is when they rebuild afterwards, they're going to have to rebuild according to those 2008 standards. So that makes them safer than they were before. So that's really important. But that moment of recovery is also an opportune time to think about other kinds of choices. Maybe not just rebuilding in the same place, maybe giving people the opportunity to move to other locations if they're tired of having to worry about fire all the time. Recovery is an opportunity for making improvements over what was there before. But I think we also all know that because there's a time imperative and really, what all survivors of a disaster, what they all have envisioned in their minds is, and it's funny what happens in their minds, that what they had before is always suddenly a perfect paradise, even though it wasn't at the time. But they dream of that perfection, that perfect moment when everything was all in order the day before the disaster. And there's a tendency to want to go back to that. But, if you dig a little deeper and you talk to individuals, even though they sort of have that vision of that they want to go back to, there's always a but. They always say, but, I wish that my house was this and that, maybe in a slightly different place, maybe it was a little bigger. I wish we had better transit stops. I mean, there's always things that they want to have better. So after disaster is an opportunity to try to do some of those things. But, it's very hard to come up with all of that and the time pressures that you have right afterwards to, do the deliberation that's needed. So it's really helpful to do that deliberation ahead of time.
I see. So really, it's all about planning ahead to be able to act once an opportunity presents itself.
Exactly. No one hopes houses will burn, so it's important to adopt mitigation behaviors and other protective measures to ensure no structures and especially no lives are lost. And yet, you have to stay realistic because fires are going to happen, houses are going to be destroyed, and so you need to have a plan to recover from that.
So what are some of these post-disaster recovery plans? What do they look like?
Well, they can be many things, right? And also it really depends on every single community. There is no one single plan that works for everyone. But the most efficient solution Rob talks about is infill housing, where you basically build new houses on vacant or underused lots. And basically the goal is to have more housing supply to be able to move people away from the fire fuel rich fringes of the cities back into their centers where it's safer. But as you can imagine, there are significant struggles with that. For one, if you have a big yard, you have a big yard for a reason, right? You want to use it, you want to play in it, you want to maybe do some gardening, and you don't want another house on there. And it's also, like we talked about, people are moving into the Wui to have more space, to have more green space, etc. So there are significant struggles with infill housing, and providing more of it has been very slow.
To our credit, the state is getting just tougher and tougher every new cycle on putting pressure on municipalities to provide their share of housing. And there's just more incentives and disincentives, and so that localities are really increasingly obligated to provide very large numbers of housing, and that it's very challenging for them to do so. And they have to look everywhere they possibly can in their jurisdiction to find every place they can possibly add new housing. And politically, NIMBYism is alive and well, and it's just really, really hard to get. What we really need is more infill housing, and everybody knows it, and every municipality is trying their darndest to do that. But it's so long, and it's so much trouble. And it turns out that it's not easy to build new housing out on the edges either, because there's all kinds of laws, restrictions, environmental regulations, etc. But it's less hard to build that new housing on the fringes in the wildland areas than it is as infill housing. And so that's sort of another problem. And then they build that housing there, and then, as you said, then it burns. And and again, when you think about the state's housing crisis, and where every time you add 100 new units, it's like we have a parade. It's just so amazing. And then a fire will come along and burn 3,000 of them in an instant. It's depressing, to say the least. But that's another part of the problem. And again, so if we could build more of those housing as infill, close to existing services, where it's providing less strain on the environment, creating fewer greenhouse gases, not disrupting the natural environment, we could protect them easier from fires, and they're just going to be less likely to then burn and have us have to worry about rebuilding them afterwards.
Interesting. I can see how this becomes a really big challenge when, in the short term, it's easier to keep building in the WUI, but we know that in the long term, the costs are going to be high. There's going to be a lot of damage to these new homes, and it doesn't solve the problem. Many Californians are still upset at the housing costs, and infill isn't the most desirable solution for individuals. So what can we do? What are some of the options here?
Well, I think the big thing is not to force people out of the WUI, but to incentivize them to move into safer areas on their own terms, right? And there are a few things that Rob mentioned in his work that can be done. So, you can support post-disaster funding for multifamily and missing middle infill housing development. So that's the big one. And then, of course, you can, give a disincentive to stay in the WUI and an incentive to move into the city center. So that could, for example, be a wildfire prevention and mitigation fees on property owners in very high fire hazard risk zones. So tax them for living there, but then offer a tax incentive if they move away, right? If they relocate out of the WUI. And one other thing in the report is that you should require all local governments to conduct pre-disaster recovery and resilience planning. As we talked about, it is very important to have a plan before a fire burns. So, make it mandatory for local government to have those on hand.
So I can see how these incentives are supposed to work, but does moving houses away from the WUI actually reduce the number of houses being burnt? I mean, I could imagine a scenario where fires reach into developments not directly to the WUI. The situation is changing, our climate's changing, potential for bigger wildfires and new locations is changing as well.
So one of the cases we looked at was in Ventura County, and we were struck by Ventura County as a whole over the last, I want to say it's like 2 decades, have really, really upped their game in terms of emphasizing protecting the natural open spaces. And that was their, 20 years ago, that was the driving reason behind what they were doing. And over time, they've tightened up the policies, and each of the cities in Ventura County has bought into this as well. And the driving reason for doing this was for protecting open space and maintaining the quality of the natural environment that they saw as the reason why they valued living in Ventura County. And it's very successful now. And so now when you have the pressure from the state asking all the municipalities to add housing, it turns out in Ventura County, I've talked about how it's relatively less hard to build at the edges. Well, in Ventura County, it's not. It's really hard to expand the size of the footprint of jurisdictions. They really, in order to add the housing, they have to do it as infill. And, our case was looking at the Thomas Fire, the 2017 Thomas Fire in Ventura. And it did damage a lot of houses. But all these fires at the time, they're the largest fire in history of California. And that one was in its time, too. But compared to the size of that fire, the amount of houses that it did burn, and it's unfortunate to burn any, was really relatively small because of all that open space there. So here, Ventura County started out, their policy was for protecting the environment and natural open space, but it's had these benefits we now see as also, as protecting against fire and fitting very nicely with the state's increasing imperative to build new affordable housing within existing developed areas. So I don't know, that's kind of a way of illustrating how really all of these things are closely linked to each other. That it's now becoming more clear.
So that's really good news. It does sound that even though infill might be complicated in some instances, it can work. And it might not work in every single case, in every single community, but it is something that's being underutilized that could apply to more communities.
Exactly. Like you said, we are on the right track, but there is still one major struggle, and we kind of touched on it before, but it is the insurance time imperative.
Right now, people are having trouble getting insurance in the high fire zones, as it's logical. But people who have lived there for a long time, that's a great hardship on them. But from the point of view of the insurance companies, they continue to insure these places that are burning at a more rapid rate. They're going to go bankrupt. They're going to have to pull out of the state, and that hurts all of us. So we need to find some middle ground here. And, we suggest that there is a logic to letting insurance companies raise the rates in the riskiest areas, provided that they can also reward hazard mitigation, both on an individual household level as well as regional and neighborhood levels, that those things can be reflected in the rates. And then also that there's got to be some kind of provision for people who currently live in those places who may have lower incomes, that may just be immediately driven out if they had to have higher rates, some way of gradually being able to deal with them. But it's got to be a part of it, because otherwise you just know that all of those, the property insurers in the state, they're finding we're all paying in some ways for this. I'm sure it's reflected in my rates. Something's going to give in insurance, and I don't know how that's going to sort out. But that's sort of where I've been kind of keeping my eye, because the rates really are going up, that there's a lot of people in very high fire hazard areas are not able to even get insurance. And that's just, that crisis is just increasing. And there was a moratorium 2 years ago. They initiated it after there was a lot of fires in the zip codes where there were major fires, or next to areas where there were major fires, that the insurers couldn't non-renew the policies. And they keep extending that moratorium, but they can't extend it forever. They can't keep adding on whenever there's any new fires. They're not going to be able to do that. At some point, the insurers are going to crack. And when that happens, either all the insurers are going to leave the state and we're all going to be in trouble, or else some kind of a compromise is going to have to be reached. And so I don't know when that's going to happen. I thought it was going to happen this last year, but it didn't. And but at some point, that's going to change the landscape in terms of a lot of the significant economics behind building on the wildland-urban interface. So anyway, those are the two difficult areas that I'm keeping an eye on.
So I can see how we're getting to a critical point here, and this is an urgent issue. So I want to go back to Dan, since he's worked as a firefighter, has a lot of experience here. So Dan, if you could change one law tomorrow, which one would it be?
I'm not sure how I could change it, but removing flammable materials and vegetation from within 100 feet of structure is the most cost-effective way to reduce wildland fire hazard around structures. I think that the law is currently enforced by inspections. The issue is that CAL FIRE and the other fire protection agencies that cover the WUI parts of the state don't have the amount of funds it takes to do a door-to-door inspection process. So they try to target their inspections based on the locations of the fire hazards. So, and inevitably, the fire is going to start in a place that hasn't been inspected.
All right. So the good news is that there have been new developments on the legislative side. And the timeline is actually really interesting because just a few weeks after Rob published his research, Governor Newsom passed his recall election, right? That was in September of last year. He signed 3 new laws. Those were Senate Bills 8, 9, and 10. And he was aiming to address the statewide housing crisis with them. So just very briefly, Senate Bill 8 extends the Houses Crisis Act of 2019 through 2030. Senate Bill 9 ends single-family zoning and allows up to 4 units on a single-family lot. So that really goes towards infill housing. And then Senate Bill 10 makes it easier to build high-density housing, which, again, also goes towards infill housing.
So, Rob, were these the changes that you were advocating for?
Yes, absolutely. Because really, to my way of thinking, the most significant way that we can really shift this, and as I described the problem earlier, really the most difficult barrier right now is we have this great need for housing, and we really need to build more affordable, high-density infill housing in already served areas, and that's going to deal with, as I said, address the climate issues, and it's the best place to put housing that we can protect them from the threat of fires as well. And it provides opportunities for us to be able to undo the risks we've created in a lot of these wildland urban interface areas, because then they would actually have options where they can move to. And so that's like the dramatic need in the state anyway. But as far as dealing with the fire problem, really dramatically upping our game with infill housing is the most direct way.
Right, Rob, that seems really good that things are finally moving. But as we know, signing laws and making policies is great. You get the journalists taking pictures of you, it all looks good. But actually enforcing those new laws and policies is usually much harder and slower as well. And so what kind of timeline are we working with here?
Yeah, it is a good question. It's very slow. But, I see it around me here that there are, once you sort of get in tune with how long it takes, you see an empty lot that's on a major boulevard that's just crying out for a new multi-story building, and it just sits there for years. So I've sort of gotten tuned into recognizing that that's the case. And now that I'm sort of seeing it, now I'm noticing actually several of them, near my house here are showing signs of construction happening on them. And so it's not like in China, construction at the pace, urbanization, how it happens there. But it's happening. And it's definitely a result of all of these policies. And I know my wife is a community development director in a Bay Area jurisdiction here. And I know that they're working as hard as they can, and they are slowly approving housing, and they're slowly building the housing. So it's going to happen, but it's not a 3-year thing. It's 10 year, 20 years. I think we'll see. And I think over the last 10 or 20 years, there has been some noticeable changes, but I think it's going to significantly accelerate. But I don't know, but who knows? There's climate change also. We'll just kind of have to see what happens there. I think there's, to me, sort of the 2 biggest kind of policy challenges ahead. There's sort of easy stuff and hard stuff. The easy stuff is, we all like green spaces, and we all are willing to pay money for firefighters to put out fires. But one of the hard things is the one that we just talked about, which is building this infill housing and through all of the obstacles that are in its way. And that's just going to take continued effort, and it's a continuing challenge. There's going to be more bills by the legislature and other continuing efforts to keep our foot on the accelerator for that.
So it sounds like there's some really good news in this, that we are moving forward on housing policy changes that are going to help combat the things we know that are happening with wildfire seasons. We know that going forward, the wildfire season is getting longer in California. We know the fires are burning hotter and across greater distances, and with that comes a lot more destruction to housing, but we are seeing progress here.
Oh, absolutely. Basically, the red line in policy has to be, not to force people out of the WUI like we've talked about, but to incentivize them to adopt risk mitigation behaviors and to help them move out of there if that is what they wish to do, right? So that is providing more infill housing and provide some incentives to move to these safer places if they, again, wish to do so.
So basically, as other policy is unfolding that's going to help mitigate, like climate policy and more environmental land management and land stewardship policy, like we've briefly discussed in the past, we want to make sure that there are still laws unfolding for infill housing and double down on those mitigation behaviors, so less houses are burning and less communities are at severe risk.
Absolutely, and I guess another thing is just realizing that wildfires are just such a big issue, and housing policy is just like one teeny tiny bit of the solutions that can come. But luckily we have a lot of very intelligent people doing amazing work on this, like Rob, for instance, right, who joined us today, who published the paper Rebuilding for a Resilient Recovery, which I encourage everybody to read. It has fascinating case studies and many more proposed policies. And of course, we also have people on the ground like Dan, who works with the California Fire Safe Council. And they do amazing work by, providing guidance to homeowners and communities and giving out grants so people can afford to adopt mitigation behaviors. But actually, Dan, can you tell us about the California Fire Safe Council's mission and goals?
Well, our main goal is to be California's leader in community wildfire risk reduction and resiliency, which is our organization's official goal. The tactics we use to achieve that, we, number one, promote the creation and support of fire safe councils as a means of reaching out throughout neighborhoods and towns and counties to advocate for implementation of fire protection measures in their own communities. The other thing we do is we serve as a clearinghouse for fire protection grants to communities. We're a 501c3 tax-exempt organization founded in 2002, and basically the reason we were created was to facilitate the movement of federal, state, nonprofit, and other private grant funds to communities for the purpose of doing fire prevention, fire protection work.
And so talking a bit of money, in 2020, your organization was awarded $1.4 million. And what was this money spent on, and what impact did it have?
That was U.S. Forest Service grant money that was granted to us, and for the sole purpose of subgranting that money out to communities throughout California based on competitive application of projects. And that money funded projects in 10 of California's 58 counties. It was $1.4 million that was awarded, and it generated matching contributions of $1.702 million. So that came from the communities and the grantees. So it's more than a 50-50 benefit to the public. Money goes to nonprofit organizations, homeowners associations, and any non-federal agency such as a city, county, water district, resource conservation district, so forth. So they're used for hazardous fuel reduction, community wildfire protection projects, and community risk assessments. So the projects in that $1.4 million block are all scheduled to end on October 31st of this year.
Awesome. All right. Again, Dan, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you a well-deserved retirement full of adventures. And of course, Rob, big thanks to you as well, and we look forward to seeing what other pieces of research you will have coming out in the next few years. And of course, Emily, thanks for being such a great co-host and joining me on today's episode on housing.
It's been my pleasure, Jonas, and to keep on this thank you train. Thank you for all the work you've done on this and sharing your insights and findings with us. It's been really interesting to talk about housing.